Some people think talent comes with a diploma, an important surname, or easy applause. But what do you do when true genius hides behind a simple uniform and work-hardened hands? This story isn't just about music, it's about silent courage, social prejudice, and the power of a woman who knew how to transform her pain into melody. Clara was just a janitor, invisible to the cultural elite who frequented that music conservatory. As she cleaned the hallways, she kept within herself a gift that no one there suspected existed. Until one unexpected moment, an arrogant comment from a conductor lit a spark, and what came next silenced an entire room. Get ready for a heartwarming tale of overcoming obstacles, an underestimated woman, a forgotten piano, and a performance that turned into a life lesson for everyone who has ever been judged by their appearance. If you believe that humility with wisdom is more powerful than any resume, this story was made for you. And in the end, you might discover that the most beautiful notes aren't in the sheet music, but in the souls of those who endured in silence. Take a deep breath and listen to every last key of this moving story, because today, the stage is hers. Clara always arrived before everyone else. While the city was still lounging, she was already there, cleaning hallways that smelled of old sheet music. Her steps were light, her eyes alert, and she had the demeanor of someone who'd learned to listen to the world in silence. Between one cloth and the next, she'd let out a discreet smile as she passed through the rehearsal rooms. It wasn't uncommon to find her standing in the doorway for a few seconds, listening to the notes coming from the expensive pianos or the voices warming up. No one paid any attention to her there. She was just the caretaker. But what no one saw was that Clara didn't just hear with her ears. She felt every note. She knew the pieces, the composers, the measures. She knew where the emotion lived in each melody. Her hands were steady for work, but her fingers were as soft as those guarding an old secret. In her spare time, when the building emptied, Clara would run her fingers over the keys of the old piano, forgotten in the basement. She played softly, afraid of being overheard, like someone talking to an old friend who understands, without needing to respond. She never told anyone, but music was what kept her going. It wasn't just a pastime, it was a shelter, a memory, an old love. And even though life had pushed her away from the stage never left her. Clara didn't know when or how, but deep down, she always believed that music still had something to say to her. The San Gabriel Conservatory was almost a temple, the kind where art was breathed and difficult conversations were made. The corridors were lined with polished wood, stained glass windows filtered the light like in ancient churches, and the walls were decorated with sepia portraits of maestros who never seemed to smile. Inside, every detail exuded tradition. Well-dressed students hurried past with sheet music tucked under their arms, talking about symphonies and international festivals. Many carried influential surnames and lived in a world where talent was expected and the rest ignored. Between the practice rooms and the expensive cafes, there was an almost suffocating air of exclusivity. The teachers, demanding; the conductors, rigorous. A veteran's word was worth more than any applause from the audience. It was an environment where making a mistake in public could cost you a semester, and where improvising was seen as disrespectful. Music was taken seriously, perhaps too seriously. And so, anyone who fell outside that mold was invisible. Clara, with her broom and her old headphones, passed by there every day like a shadow unseen. But she heard everything, every off-key tune, every backstage outburst, every arrogance disguised as a demand. It was in that contrast between Thelite cultural and the woman who knew how to feel music without ostentation that the story began to take shape, note by note. It was a morning like so many others. Clara had finished cleaning the main hall and before leaving, discreetly approached the grand piano in the center of the room. She glanced around. No one seemed around. She sat down gently, took a deep breath, and let her fingers run over a few keys. The notes came out softly, almost like a whisper, but not all was empty. Maestro Alvaro Figueiredo, known for his difficult temperament and sharp vanity, watched from the half-open door. He entered silently and interrupted the short melody with a dry comment. "You don't seem to understand music." The sentence came cold, cutting, as if the sound of the keys were an unforgivable error. Clara stood up immediately without looking at him. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from embarrassment. The maestro stared at her as if staring at a misplaced chair. There was no empathy in his tone, only superiority. To him, the scene was almost offensive. A talented caretaker too, much for the job, but too poor for the stage. The students entering only saw the end of the scene, but it was enough to provoke giggles. "The cleaning lady wants to be a pianist now," someone murmured. Clara didn't answer. She simply picked up her bucket and left silently, as if politely erasing her own existence. But there, in that moment, something he never anticipated began to unfold. Poetic justice, with a taste of revenge. The sound of the keys had stopped, but the echo of that comment still lingered in the air. Clara walked the halls with her eyes on the floor, trying to swallow what she felt. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the cruel confirmation that, to many there, she was nothing more than someone who swept away other people's dreams without the right to have her own. In the cafeteria, the looks came in disguised. Some students who had witnessed the scene commented in hushed tones, laughing at the audacity of the anonymous pianist. Others just remained silent, uncomfortable, and, as always, no one did anything. The judgment by appearance spoke louder than any compassion. Even the teachers, who knew that talent sometimes hides where no one is looking, avoided any kind of involvement. After all, to contradict Maestro Alvaro was to risk their own position. Power of silence was once again an accomplice to injustice, and Clara, even though hurt, understood that her best response would still be given calmly. She returned to work with the same dedication. She cleaned the same steps, organized the same rooms. But now, something in her had changed. It wasn't anger, nor a desire for revenge. It was a kind of quiet, almost invisible strength, a courage that needed neither a stage nor an audience. Silent courage, made of pain, but also of dignity. Before becoming a janitor, Clara was a student at another conservatory, a much more modest one in a small rural town. She was 13 when she played the piano for the first time in a church after a choir rehearsal. The teacher, surprised, called her parents and said, "This girl has perfect pitch." But back then, talent didn't pay the bills. Her father had abandoned the family, and her mother fell ill early. Clara dropped out of school to work in a bakery, then in a laundromat, and then as a general laborer. Still, she never strayed from music. She carried sheet music scribbled in school notebooks, listened to old recordings on the radio, and practiced wherever she could, even on toy keyboards. Little by little, she learned toplay by ear, feeling each melody with her soul. She had no degree, nor a conservatory, but she carried an emotional repertoire that many technical musicians would never know. It was as if the piano were her confession, her prayer, her living memory of who she dreamed of being. Each day at the conservatory, Clara remembered everything she had given up. But instead of lamenting, she transformed her longing into affection for her grades. She held within herself a truth few saw, sometimes hidden talent lives precisely in those who had to survive before shining. And this truth cannot be taught with sheet music. Tomas was one of those students who walked around with his cello on his back and his eyes wide open to the world. A scholarship student, he came from a simple family and knew all too well what it was like to feel like he didn't belong. Perhaps that's why he noticed something in Clara that others didn't. Her silence wasn't empty, it was full of untold stories. During breaks, while his colleagues talked about trips to Europe and masterclasses in Vienna, Tomas preferred to stay in the back garden near the materials storage area. It was there that he first saw Clara humming a Chopin melody while sweeping the floor. She never sounded out of tune. He stopped and asked curiously, "Do you know that piece?" She smiled sideways. "Yes, I have," "Since I was a little girl." That answer stuck in his head. He began to notice more. The way she arranged the chairs in the rehearsal room, always positioned as if she knew the orchestra's formation. The way she observed the musicians, as if she could conduct with her gaze. Clara didn't pretend to understand music. She felt music like few others. Over time, Tomas began to strike up a conversation whenever he could. He wanted to hear more, and the more he listened, the more impressed he became. Clara didn't have the arrogance of technical knowledge, but she had the humility with wisdom, the kind that comes from someone who learned from life, not from status. And there, in that unexpected bond, the thread that would change their destiny was born. It was a rainy night, and the school was already empty. Tomas had stayed up late practicing and saw Clara turning off the lights in the main hall. He felt the time was right. He approached cautiously and said with an almost complicit smile, "The piano is tuned. All it needs is someone who knows how to feel." Clara laughed suspiciously. He insisted, "Sit there, just you and me." She hesitated. It had been years since I'd played a grand piano, one of those with a full goosebump-inducing sound, but something in Tomas's gaze reassured her. He sat down slowly, as if asking the instrument for permission. He took a deep breath and then let his fingers glide across the keys. The melody that emerged wasn't from the conservatory's sheet music. It was made of longing and courage. Tomas held his breath. It was like hearing the past and present dancing together. Clara played with pure emotion, with raw soul, with that emotional overcoming that transforms each note into a narrative. He couldn't resist. He took his cell phone out of his pocket and discreetly recorded a few excerpts. Not to expose it, but to preserve the moment like someone saving a miracle in a jar. When Clara finished, there was no applause, only silence. But it was the kind of silence that speaks volumes. Tomas approached, his eyes brimming with tears, and said, "You need to be heard." She responded with only a shy but firm look. There, in that empty room, a message was beginning to emerge. Narrative of overcoming that no one would dare write, but that she was about to live. Tomas hadn't intended to expose Clara, but when he showed the video to a trusted colleague, the enchantment was immediate, and the recording took on a life of its own. Within hours, it was circulating among students and teachers, provoking admiration, surprise, and, of course, comments disguised as praise. "Who is she again?" they asked. "Janitor?" they murmured, almost in disbelief. The video reached Maestro Alvaro, who watched with his arms crossed and a hard expression. When it finished, he simply said, "Playing by ear isn't art, it's luck." But even he, deep down, knew there was something there that no sheet music could explain, because Clara wasn't following time, she was following feeling, and that bothered them more than they could admit. While some musicians were touched by the emotion on the improvised stage, others reacted with the discomfort typical of those who feel threatened by a talent emerging where it shouldn't. Clara's presence was beginning to become unsustainable for the old system that divided stage and backstage as if they were two incompatible worlds. But it was too late. The flame was still burning. And even if no one had the courage to praise her publicly, everyone knew there was something special about her, simple woman who surprises with the power of music. And the most disconcerting thing, she didn't want a stage, she just wanted to play. And that, for many there, was the most revolutionary gesture of all. The conservatory was buzzing with anticipation. The board was organizing a benefit concert to support a social project focused on the musical inclusion of underprivileged youth. It would be the most important night of the semester, with sponsors, journalists, and even a small guest orchestra in attendance. The stage was ready. The chairs were lined up. The musicians were rehearsed, but fate, as always, had other plans. With less than an hour to go, the principal pianist suffered a sudden illness and cancelled his performance. Maestro Alvaro panicked. Experienced replacements were out of reach, and the closest alternative, a second-year student, shuddered at the thought. The risk of being out of tune on stage was too great for the venue's standards. It was then that Tomas calmly raised his hand and suggested the unthinkable. Clara can play. She knows the repertoire. The room fell into an uncomfortable, almost offensive silence. Some laughed nervously, others swallowed hard. The conductor hesitated, but time was of the essence. He nodded, as if to say, if it's a disaster, it's your fault. Backstage, Clara was notified. She was in uniform, without makeup, with her hair tied up haphazardly. "Want to try?" they asked. She took a deep breath. She didn't ask why or by whom. She simply said, "Give me 5 minutes with the piano." At that moment, she was no longer the invisible caretaker. It was anonymous pianist about to show that music transforms lives, even when no one believes them. Tomas knew the risk he was taking. Suggest a talented caretaker as a substitute for a professional pianist was, for many there, an almost unforgivable boldness. But he didn't back down. He looked firmly at the conductor and said, "She doesn't just know how to play, she feels every note. And, with all due respect, you know that." Maestro Alvaro, his ego bruised and his reputation at stake, paced backstage. His discomfort was palpable. The event was about to begin. The guests were already taking their seats, and there was no time for debate. Swallowing his pride, he nodded curtly. "Let her play, but if you mess up, her name shouldn't even be mentioned." Clara, for her part, remained serene. She didn't ask for applause or reassurances. He made only one request. "Can you keep the stage lights low? I wanted the attention to be on the music, not on her." She was still wearing her grey work uniform, but her posture was stage-ready, erect, determined, humble. Here was an ordinary woman, ready to offer something extraordinary. As she took the stage, the audience murmured inexorably. Students whispered, sponsors frowned. But when Clara sat at the piano and placed her fingers on the keys, everything stopped. It was as if time took a step back to hear her. And in that pause, between the sigh and the first note, the beginning of a exciting twist. The first notes emerged timidly, almost as if asking permission to exist in that judgmental environment. But it took only a few bars for the audience to understand. This wasn't a performance. It was a confession in musical form. Clara wasn't just playing with her hands. She was playing with memories, with longing, with everything she had already swallowed in silence. The hall was gripped by a dense emotion, the kind that can't be explained in words. People looked at each other in shock. Others closed their eyes to absorb every nuance of the melody. There was technique, yes, but what held everyone there was something greater. The power of silence transformed into living art. Even Maestro Alvaro, previously unyielding, had to relax his shoulders and lower his eyes. That one masterful execution, made by a woman invisible to the eyes of the system, swept away any trace of doubt. The piano seemed to have known Clara for years. It was as if each key bowed to her story, not the other way around. When the last note dissolved into the air, no one applauded immediately. There was a second of silent reverence, as in sacred ceremonies, and then applause. Not timid, not obligatory, but standing, with tears, with soul. The cultural elite, who had so often ignored her in the hallways, now surrendered. There wasn't just any employee there. There was a simple woman whose surprises, which broke through social prejudice and showed that the deserved recognition, it doesn't always come with a spotlight. Sometimes it comes from a key pressed with truth. At the end of the show, Clara gave a slight nod of thanks. There was no speech, no posing, just the serenity of someone who knew the value of what she had just done. Backstage, no one dared look at her with disdain. Personal transformation had been silent, but definitive. The conservatory director approached and, his voice still trembling, asked, "Have you ever considered teaching here?" Maestro Alvaro, still stunned, kept his distance. But days later, he discreetly left a note in the cleaning closet with a folded sheet of music and 3 handwritten words. "Sorry, you won." It wasn't a defeat for him. It was a liberation. For the first time, he recognized that classical musical, so lives beyond the noble halls, and that humility with wisdom is often true virtuosity. Clara accepted the invitation to teach, but kept her work uniform on the days she wasn't playing the piano. "There's still a lot of ground to cover around here," she would say, with a smile that mixed irony and tenderness. The fame she didn't seek came naturally. She became a role model for her students, a living example of the hidden talent blooms when watered with courage. And so, between chords and wheels, between keys and buckets, Clara proved that the stage does not belong to whoever shouts the loudest, but to those who touch us most deeply. Because in a world that insists on dividing us by status, she reminded us that the highest note is that of truth, and that sometimes just one song is enough to touch the heart of an entire room and forever change the way it hears life. How many times have you judged someone by their clothes, their position, or their silence? And how many incredible stories do we miss? Just because the world taught us to look at the outside before listening to the inside. The truth is, everyone carries a stage within them. Some just need space, others, courage. And then there are those like Clara who just need a chance, a note, a moment, a gesture of trust. Because sometimes the greatest symphony comes from those the world has tried to silence. What about you? Have you ever felt invisible even though you had something great inside you? Have you ever been underestimated because you didn't have the right diploma, the right surname, the right place? If so, know that you're not alone. And this story was made to remind you what you have inside can still move a lot of people out there. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like to help us spread more narratives like this, from emotional overcoming, hidden talent, and real transformation. And comment below. What was the phrase, scene, or feeling that struck you the most in this video? Let's talk in the comments.